For 3 years, Sophia cared for a man who couldn't see her, literally and figuratively. After a tragic accident robbed Benjamin Carter of his sight, his world dimmed, and so did the warmth of those around him. Family members faded, friends became strangers, and bitterness took root in his heart. But Sophia remained. She was the quiet presence who brought light to his darkened world. Preparing meals, guiding his steps, and never once asking for anything in return. They met under extraordinary circumstances. Benjamin, once a promising entrepreneur from a powerful Boston family, had been reduced to a shadow of himself. Sophia, a humble caregiver from a dusty little town in Alabama, had taken the job out of necessity, but stayed because of something deeper. Hope, maybe even love. Over time, his sharp words softened, his tantrums quieted, and in the silence between them, something bloomed. He never saw her face, but he heard the kindness in her voice, felt the steadiness in her touch. And on one quiet afternoon, just before his final eye surgery, Benjamin asked her the question that had lived unspoken between them for years. "When I can see again, will you marry me?" She said yes. But she wasn't the one he proposed to. Sophia had imagined countless versions of the moment Benjamin would regain his sight. Joyful reunions, whispered promises, maybe even a quiet wedding by the lake where she first fell in love with his words. What she never imagined was watching him slide a diamond ring onto another woman's finger. That day, she'd overslept on the bus, exhausted from late-night care routines and the mounting emotional toll of hope. She sprinted through the hospital corridor, her heart galloping with anticipation. But when she pushed open the door, the scene before her shattered something deep inside her. Benjamin was smiling, brighter than she'd seen in years, but not at her. Standing beside him, dressed in designer perfection, was Evelyn Chase, his former fiancée, the same woman who had once publicly humiliated him, who had spat venom at his weakest moment. And now, as Sophia watched from the doorway, Evelyn leaned into Benjamin's embrace, feigning a teary smile as he said the words. "Thank you for being there for me these past 3 years. I don't deserve your love." Evelyn's eyes flickered toward Sophia for just a second. Cold, smug, victorious. Sophia's heart cracked. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to explain. But before a sound could escape, Benjamin's mother, Mrs. Carter, gently pulled her aside. Her voice was calm, cutting like crystal. "Sophia, my son comes from a world that you do not belong to," she said. "If it weren't for the accident, your paths would have never crossed. You were needed during his darkest hour. But now, he needs someone who fits his world." Sophia clenched her fists. She wanted to yell that it wasn't about money or class or polished appearances. It was about love, real, raw, unfiltered. But the lump in her throat refused to let the words out. Mrs. Carter sighed, her tone softening just slightly. "He realizes who truly stood by him. I won't stand in his way. But if he doesn't, perhaps that's all the answer you need." Sophia returned to the room, just in time to see Evelyn lift her chin and command. "Go peel me an apple, will you?" The meaning was clear. She wasn't asking for an apple. She was declaring dominance. Sophia wasn't the woman Benjamin loved. She was the maid, and Benjamin didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't even look twice. He simply nodded and said, "Go ahead, peel one for her." As if those 3 years, those whispered stories, those trembling nights through thunderstorms, those stolen heartbeats, meant absolutely nothing. Sophia's hands trembled around the knife, but her resolve didn't. Not yet. The days after the engagement announcement blurred into one another. Sophia moved through the Carter estate like a ghost. Present, but unseen. She tended to Benjamin's meals, his medication, the little routines she had memorized over the past 3 years. He barely looked her way. Not once did he call her name. Each morning, Evelyn invented new ways to degrade her. "This towel smells," she'd say with a wrinkle of her nose. "Change it. Bring me tea. Not that cheap kind you usually serve. Don't speak unless spoken to." And Benjamin? He stayed silent, complicit in every cruelty. Sophia told herself to leave. Every day she packed her bag in her head. But the hope, thin as a thread, still tied her there. Maybe, she thought, maybe he'd remember. Then came the party. It was a pre-wedding celebration at the Carter mansion, flooded with laughter and expensive champagne. Sophia wasn't invited, of course, but she was asked to serve. Invisible. As always. She moved through the crowd with a tray in her hands, trying not to hear Benjamin's laughter echoing through the halls that once knew her quiet humming. Then she heard it. A low conversation, tucked into the corner of the lounge, just loud enough to reach her ears. Benjamin. One of his friends said, leaning in with a frown. Did you know it was the maid who took care of you all these years? Not Evelyn. It was Sophia. She was the one who stayed. Benjamin didn't pause. He didn't blink. I know. He replied flatly, swirling the wine in his glass. Then why? The friend asked, genuinely puzzled. Benjamin smirked, his tone dismissive. You ever heard the saying? The first thing a blind man does when he regains his sight is throw away his cane. Sophia froze in place, the tray trembling in her hands. She saw me broken. Benjamin continued, as if he were discussing a piece of furniture. My weakest. That's all she'll ever be. A crutch. A reminder. You don't build a future with someone who's seen you that pathetic. The words struck harder than any slap. Sophia backed away, careful not to drop the tray. Her heart didn't break, it shattered. Clean, cold, that was it, the truth. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, he knew, he always knew. She went to her room that night, and wrote her resignation letter with hands that barely stopped shaking. When she handed it to Mrs. Carter the next morning, the woman said nothing, just nodded and reached for a check. 200,000, blood money, silence money. Sophia took it, not for the cash, but for closure. Later that night, with one suitcase and nothing but broken memories, she boarded a southbound train. She didn't know where she was going. Only that she was never coming back. The train rattled steadily beneath her as Sophia stared out the window, the trees blurring into streaks of green and gold. She had no plan, no destination, just the crushing weight of goodbye, and the faint pulse of something fragile beneath it, freedom. She got off in Ruston, a sleepy town hugged by wildflowers and framed by cloudless skies. The kind of place where time felt slower, where people waved from porches and storefronts smelled like cinnamon and coffee. It was nothing like the Carter estate. No marble, no chandeliers, no echoes of names spoken like curses. Sophia found a room above a bakery and began to work odd jobs. With the severance money, she eventually opened a tiny flower shop called Blissful Blooms, where every bouquet she made felt like a quiet act of healing. And that's where she met Jacob. He was nothing like Benjamin. Where Benjamin had been cold and calculated, Jacob was warm and wonderfully clumsy. A college student with messy dark hair, sharp green eyes, and the energy of someone who hadn't been broken yet. The first time they met, he'd thought she was going to jump off a lakeside cliff, and tackled her to the ground in panic. She laughed for the first time in months. They started as accidental friends. He'd stop by the shop during his night runs, bringing her random snacks and lame jokes. He never pried, never asked her to explain the sadness in her eyes. He just stayed. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset melt across the lake, he said softly, "You don't have to say anything, but I hope you know you deserve more than what hurt you." Something in her cracked open at that. Because for years, Sophia had been surviving on scraps of love, scraps of attention, scraps of being almost enough. But here was someone who saw her not as a crutch or a memory, but as a person, a woman, deserving of gentleness. She started to smile more, breathe easier. The days no longer dragged, they bloomed, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include Benjamin's name stitched into every corner of it. Jacob's presence, once incidental, became comforting. She found herself looking for him, leaning into his warmth, laughing at his dumb puns. But even as she moved forward, a shadow lingered, the echo of Benjamin's voice, the sting of betrayal, the years she gave him. Letting go wasn't a moment, it was a process. Slow, uneven, but it had begun. Sophia wasn't the same woman who had knelt beside a broken man, praying love would save them both. She was rising now. And this time, it was for herself. Sophia hadn't planned to fall for Jacob. She told herself it was too soon, Too fragile, too complicated. But love has a way of creeping in. Not like lightning, but like sunlight through a curtain. Quiet, persistent, warm. He started helping her at the shop more often. Claimed it was part of a work-study project. Though the luxury watch on his wrist and the gleaming car he parked down the block told a different story. She never called him out. Let him have his excuse. He watered the plants with too much enthusiasm, mislabeled bouquets, and once confused a daisy for a dahlia. But when he smiled and muttered, "Learning is part of the charm," she found herself smiling back. Genuinely. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. Blissful Blooms, Sophia speaking. She answered, cradling the receiver against her shoulder as she arranged tulips. There was silence. Then a breath. Sophia. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Her fingers froze. Benjamin. 3 months had passed, no calls, no letters, no apologies. You really left? He whispered. I went to your hometown. You weren't there. She kept her tone light, detached. That home never existed. I made it up. I didn't know, he said. I thought you'd come back. You thought wrong. The silence stretched. Then his voice cracked, low and raw. I'm getting married next week. I want you to come. Sophia's heart didn't ache. Not like before. Instead, she felt something surprising. Calm. I can't, she replied softly. I'm getting married too. She wasn't. Not yet. But she wanted to mean it. When she hung up, she didn't shake. Didn't cry. She turned around and found Jacob standing there, holding a small bouquet of fresh-cut roses. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. That night, over takeout and mismatched candles, Sophia looked at him. Really looked. His easy laughter. The way he quietly replaced the light bulbs in her shop without being asked. The way he listened. Jacob, she said suddenly. He turned, a noodle dangling from his chopsticks. Yeah. Let's give this a try. For real. His eyes widened. Wait. Are you asking me out? Officially? She laughed. Yes, officially. Jacob beamed so brightly it lit up the entire room. Then it's a yes. 1,000 times yes. The next morning, he showed up with a brand new shop sign that read, Sophia and Jacob's Blissful Blooms. She made him take it down, but she didn't stop smiling for the rest of the week. Sophia didn't need to be someone's savior anymore. She didn't need to be remembered to feel valued. This slow, patient, imperfect love was something new. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing it. She was choosing it. Sophia never imagined she'd be the type to fall in love again. At least not like this. With Benjamin, it had been longing, quiet desperation, a hope born from years of shared pain. But with Jacob, it was laughter during slow mornings, silent support during hectic flower deliveries, and the way he always danced in the kitchen when he thought she wasn't looking. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Every day, Jacob did little things, warming her coffee cup on cold mornings, organizing her receipts with color-coded tabs, learning flower names just to impress her, even though he still got peonies and poppies confused. Sophia, too, was changing. She no longer looked in the mirror and saw the girl who once peeled apples for a man who forgot her name. She saw someone whole. Someone real. The past hadn't disappeared. It still visited her sometimes. Like when a customer mentioned Boston, or a pair of dark sunglasses caught her eye. But those memories no longer held power over her. They were just shadows in a room now filled with sunlight. One night, while closing up the shop, Jacob stood by the door watching her. Can I ask you something? He said, voice hesitant. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. Of course. You called me sweetheart the other day, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't say anything then, but does it mean I'm officially yours now? Sophia blinked, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. She walked over, resting her hands on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. You've been mine for a while, she said. I just finally had the courage to say it. Jacob leaned down and kissed her forehead. Then let me do something crazy. He knelt, right there, among buckets of daffodils and stems of eucalyptus, and pulled a ring from his pocket. Sophia Lane, he said, his voice trembling slightly, You once told me you didn't believe love could be easy. But I want to prove you wrong. I want to spend the rest of my life making it simple. Soft. Honest. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to her eyes, not the kind that came from pain, but from healing. From peace. Yes, she whispered. Yes. They got married under a canopy of wildflowers behind the shop. No chandeliers. No polished marble. Just laughter, petals in the wind, and the scent of lavender on the breeze. As she stood beside Jacob, his fingers laced with hers, his eyes glowing with pride, Sophia realized something powerful. She hadn't just survived heartbreak, she had rewritten her story. And in that story, she was never just the maid. She was the hero. The morning of the wedding, the air buzzed with quiet excitement. The flower shop had been transformed into a garden dream. Bouquets of daisies, lavender garlands, and soft music floating through the breeze. Sophia stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back, not because of the delicate lace gown or the rose gold earrings, but because she looked happy. Radiantly, unapologetically happy. 3 years ago, she would have given anything to see herself in Benjamin's world. To be his wife, his partner, his equal. But that dream had been built on illusions, stitched together with hope and silence, and when it unraveled, it took part of her with it. But she rebuilt herself, not around a man, around her own strength. As the ceremony began, Sophia walked down the aisle lined with petals, the soft hum of laughter and violin surrounding her. She wasn't nervous, there were no doubts, because Jacob, standing at the altar with his shirt slightly wrinkled and eyes already glistening, wasn't just the man she loved. He was the one who had loved her gently, without asking her to shrink. As the officiant spoke, Sophia felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She had kept it on, just in case there was an emergency with the shop, but the screen flashed with a name she hadn't seen in weeks. Benjamin. A second later, it buzzed again. A voicemail, then a text. I was wrong. I see that now. Please, can we talk before you go through with it? She didn't listen to the message. Didn't open the text. She simply powered off the phone. Because the past had no place in the life she was building now. When it was her turn to speak her vows, Sophia took Jacob's hands in hers and smiled. There was a time when I believed love had to hurt. She began, her voice steady. That it meant giving everything, even when you had nothing left for yourself. But you showed me something different. You showed me that love can be kind. That it can be safe. That it can heal. Jacob's eyes shimmered. Sophia continued, her voice unwavering. I'm not promising perfection. But I promise presence. I promise laughter. I promise growth. And most of all, I promise to never forget how much it means to be seen. And loved. For exactly who I am. They kissed to the sound of soft clapping, and the gentle rustle of flowers in the wind. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, and the petals scattered in golden light, Sophia and Jacob sat together on a wooden bench outside the shop, barefoot and tired and glowing. You know, Jacob whispered, you didn't just build a flower shop. She looked at him, curious. You built a life. And for the first time in forever, Sophia believed him. Sometimes, the people we love most will break our hearts the hardest. And sometimes, the closure we crave will never come wrapped in the apology we hoped for. But that's okay. Healing doesn't require someone else's regret. It requires your choice to move on. Sophia's journey wasn't about finding the perfect man. It was about rediscovering herself after years of being unseen, unappreciated, and misunderstood. Through loss, she found resilience. Through betrayal, she found boundaries. And through letting go, she found real love. The kind that doesn't demand proof or sacrifice, just presence. Love isn't about holding on to someone who once made you feel needed. It's about choosing someone who consistently makes you feel valued. Someone who brings peace, not confusion. Kindness, not performance. In the end, Sophia didn't win because she ended up with someone. She won because she realized she didn't have to beg to be loved anymore. She became enough. For herself. In real life, many people stay in relationships long after they've turned toxic, hoping the other person will change or remember their worth. But like Sophia, we all have the right to walk away from people who only loved us when we were convenient. Your value isn't defined by how much you endure for someone else. It's in how you love yourself enough to stop settling. Don't wait for someone to wake up and see you. Wake up for yourself. Choose people who choose you. Every day, without games, without reminders, whether in love, friendship, or even work, protect your peace. You owe no one your life for being kind to them. Sometimes, the boldest thing you can do is leave.